Well, today begins the final unit in the Simeon course on biblical exposition as it relates to various genres. And we saved the Gospel and Acts unit for last. Part of the reason for that is the Gospels are complex and they contain a variety of the genres that we've already looked at. Our first lecture is going to be given by Jonathan Pennington. He is a professor of New Testament at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And he's going to help us understand the distinctives and similarities of the Gospels with a particular eye toward how to read the Gospel stories within their own context.
One of the important things that we now recognize in learning to read Holy Scripture well is, of course, recognizing the different genre or type of literature that a part of the Bible is. Now, it is important to know this because genre creates a set of expectations between the reader and the writer. Even if we don't know who that writer was, there's a certain sense of expecting what the kind of literature that I'm reading is going to communicate, how it's going to communicate, and that's very important for us to learning to read it well and to read it wisely. Now, when we talk about the genre, particularly of the Gospels, this really large part of the Bible, this central part of the Bible, the Gospels that begin the New Testament, there have been a variety of debates about what kind of genre these are throughout the history of scholarship. In earlier times, they probably didn't talk about genre so much, but at least in the modern period, there have been a number of different opinions. Some people have considered them to be really very lowbrow literature, really not much going on literarily at all, that instead the Gospels are just a bunch of Jesus traditions that are what have been called pearls on a string. So little episodes, little episodic pieces that we call pericopes, or a pericope is a little gospel story that have just been strung together with not really any foresight or any particular purpose. So very lowbrow literature. Another common way, especially for people who believe in the Bible and as God's inspired word, would see them as basically straightforward historical documentaries. Here's what happened and here's where it's recorded, and so we have our Christmas pageants with the kids in the bathrobes because that's what Luke 2 says, and even though they didn't ever show up at the manger, that's from Matthew, we kind of conflate it together, and there it is. The Magi didn't show up at the manger, that is. So it's all there together, just historical documents, just read them, and that's what they are. And of course, there's some truth to that. Or some people would say they are just religious documents of various sorts. They just are kind of telling us a bunch of religious ideas. Another more technical kind of way of genre that they've been interpreted or could be thought of would be an encomium, which means a laudatory document about some hero. There's some ways in which that is true as well. So, in fact, all these sort of different ways that the Gospels have been thought about genre-wise have some truth to them, don't they? But overall, many scholars today, including myself, would say that the best argument that can be made for the genre of the Gospels is that they are most like a related form from their own contemporary time, from roughly the first century of the Christian era and the Greco-Roman period, a type of Greek literature called a bios, or the plural, a bioi. And you can probably, bioi, plural. You can probably hear that in that our word biography comes from that, but the reason we usually say it's a bios or they are like biois because we do want to make sure that we don't just say they're biographies and thereby import exactly what you and I think of a modern biography. And we'll come back to that issue here in a moment. But often we now say the genre of the Gospels is most like an ancient bios or ancient bioi. And an ancient bios is a piece of literature that focuses on an individual, on his or her ancestry. So it's not about great acts of history, it's about an individual, like a modern biography is, about his or her ancestry, his teaching or philosophy, way of life and actions, the things that were done, their virtues and sometimes vices, and especially how they died, their death, how their life ended. Those are very typical, and you can again see that they're not dissimilar to a modern biography, but an ancient bios in Greco-Roman literature and Greek literature had certain tendencies in them that when we look at those written outside the Bible, there are a lot of them, we see that our Greek Gospels are a lot like those in many ways. So that's probably the best argument there's a fuller argument behind that, but that's the best way to think about what our Gospels are. Now that's all very good, and the person who's argued that the most forcefully and helpfully is a guy called Richard Burridge, and there's his book that we could reference as well that talks about this, and I just want to say I think that's largely a good argument and is very helpful. I would, though, want to add, and other scholars have as well, to say that although the Gospels are primarily like an ancient Greco-Roman bios, they do have some things that are a little different as well, and this is what I like to call that they are bioi plus. They're kind of on the model of a juicer plus or something. They're like beyond just a regular Greco-Roman biography, and there are a few significant ways in which I think the Gospels do stand apart beyond just being like a Greco-Roman biography, although that's their primary thing. One way is what we might call their biostructuring or story cycles actually resemble not only Greco-Roman biographies, but also very much the biostructuring and story cycles of the Hebrew Bible or of the Old Testament. Those stories, like I think, for example, of 1 Samuel and the Chronicles literature, but the Pentateuch as well, the way those stories tell themselves and the way they are told and the way they structure them on the lives of important people, Moses and Abraham and David and Samuel and others, those actually do have an influence on our Gospels, and that stands to reason, doesn't it? Because the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Scriptures of the Old Testament is certainly the primary document for earliest Christianity and for the birth of the church. And so while it's important and helpful with Burridge and others to recognize the Greco-Roman similarities to our Gospels, if we neglect the fact that they are also pretty closely related to the Hebrew Bible way of telling stories, then we're going to miss something about that genre identification. So in another significant way in which our Gospels are unique, we could say, and not exactly the same as Greco-Roman biographies, is that our Gospels are very apocalyptic and eschatological, and those are big fancy words. And apocalyptic means that it emphasizes a contrast between this age and age to come, and a contrast between heavenly realities and earthly realities. Those two axes are kind of how apocalyptic mainly functions. Our Gospels are that way, in a way that most Greco-Roman biographies of other great leaders or teachers are not that way. And eschatological is related to that, but it's looking forward to a time when God is going to consummate all of history, when He's going to bring heavenly realities to become earthly realities. Our Gospels have a lot of that in them all the way through, and something that's very different than other Greco-Roman biographies. A third way in which our Gospels are distinct is that they are very charismatic, another kind of $64,000 word. And what I mean by that word is simply that they are proclaiming and presenting the gospel, that is a message of God's saving work, in a way that, of course, most Greco-Roman biographies of great leaders or philosophers would not doing it. And finally, another unique way about the Gospels is that they make claims that go far beyond the claims that any other Greco-Roman bios would make. Claims, for example, that all of history is consummated in Jesus Christ. There's no biography is going to claim that about some philosopher or great Roman leader, that Jesus is the inaugurator of God's reign on earth, and that Jesus is a model, and we'll come back to that here in a moment. That's why you write a biography. Jesus is a model, but even more, the Gospels claim that His nature is something beyond human, that He is actually divine. That's a burden of all the Gospels and all of the New Testament. So that's very significant. And that Jesus is not just a great figure of the past to be admired or emulated, but He is actually living and present. Of course, the Gospels, like all biographies, focus on the main character's death, but of course the Gospels do something far beyond that. They claim that this one who has died has actually risen from the dead as well, and is now present with us and is an active part of our lives. No Greco-Roman biography is going to be arguing that. So I want to say again that our Gospels are primarily like Greco-Roman biographies or bioi, but they also have these distinctly Christian and biblical realities and ideas behind them. So the final question then is, what are the implications of this? Why does this matter for our learning to read well and learning to read wisely? Well, here are a few implications I can give you. First of all, it is important to recognize that our Gospels are not exactly the same thing as modern biographies. That's why we prefer, again, to call them a bios or bioi. There are, for example, some differences between the way we think about doing history and writing a biography than ancient Greco-Roman bioi did. For example, there's much more in ancient bioi, much more of a mix of chronology and topical teaching. There's a freedom, certainly to tell it accurately, certainly to tell it truthfully, but a recognition that one collects together very topical teachings and puts them together, and the chronology of how it's put together is, if we can just say it, a little bit more loose than what we might expect from a modern biography. Now, in reality, I've read a number of modern biographies. You can think of several, like of Steve Jobs or of Albert Einstein or others. And in reality, the fact is there are a well-written biography does have topical and not purely chronological elements to it as well. Oftentimes they'll jump back and forth. I remember Walter Isaacson's biography of Einstein certainly did that. There were elements of the latter story that appeared earlier because it was important for the telling and unfolding of it. So in fact, I think there is a lot of similarity between modern biographies and ancient ones, but I would say that probably it seems on balance there's even a greater freedom to topically and chronologically arrange things in an ancient biography that we may not be as used to in a modern biography. So that's important then. The point is, for when we're reading the Gospels, that we recognize that they are telling a story that is true and accurate, but it has some ways of crafting and ways of organizing the material that may not be exactly what we expect. And I think it's really easy to see this when you compare the chronology of the different Gospels that are all inspired and inerrant that we're given and see that they don't always mesh. And that's not a problem for the inspiration of God's Word or its accuracy. It's a problem with our understanding of how biographies are written. All right? So that's one implication, is recognizing what to expect from them in terms of how they write. Another very important implication of understanding the Gospel genre is that our Gospels are not disinterested history. They have a clear moral, theological, and didactic or teaching point to them, or really many points. They're not non-historical, they're not less than historical, they're not ahistorical, but they are much more than just historical accounts. And this is again where many believers in the Bible read them, again, as I said at the beginning, as just sort of being straightforward accounts of what happened. And I want to affirm that and say that's absolutely true. But to think of them only that way misses the point that they are involved in a very careful process of selection and deselection of material, crafting and fitting together of a lot of material from the many Jesus traditions that existed. You know, the Gospel of John ends by saying, all the things Jesus said and did, if we had them all, they'd fill all the books there were in the world. The point is for us, obviously there's hyperbole there, but the point is for us is that the evangelists, the gospel writers, have indeed selected and deselected certain materials, put them in different places in their gospel accounts. I think of the temple cleansing, various different teachings, and they have done that because they have a purpose. Their purpose is not merely the recording of history, but in fact the teaching of theological and moral and didactic points to us. They are, again, charismatic, they are apocalyptic, they are eschatological, didactic. They are all those things while being biographical accounts. And that's an important implication of understanding the genre, because that's exactly just like any other ancient biography. In fact, it's like all of history. There's always a point to the retelling of it, and we need to recognize that for the Gospels as well. And then finally, a third implication of this genre identification as bioi is that our Gospels, again, present Jesus and the other characters in the story, Peter and James and Paul, the Pharisees, others, as examples of both virtues to be emulated and vices to be avoided. The Gospels do present Jesus and the other the other characters, good and bad, as examples of virtue and vice. That is, I think, one of the biggest implications that we often miss, we who read the Bible and receiving it as instructive, even receiving it as theological. We often miss that the whole reason, the main reason, I should say, that you write a biography is so that you will see who the person is that you're writing about, and you will desire to not only learn from them, but desire to follow them, follow their way of life, and in seeing their own followers and their mistakes, and seeing their opponents and what they oppose about the main character, and you learn to admire and desire to follow the main character, or the biography, that is Biographee, if we can use a word that Richard Bauckham has made up, the subject of a biography, the biography with 2 E's on the end. That is an important part of why anyone wrote a biography, including the Gospels, is because to be a follower of Jesus is to actually follow his way of life and teaching, not only to believe in him and to believe theologically or historically what he did in his sacrifice on the cross and resurrection, that's true, but actually to do even more than that. That is not making that lesser, but in emphasizing that to be a follower of Christ is to actually follow him. And to do that well, you need more than historical and theological information. You need to see who he was, how he interacted with people, what kind of way of life and way of being in the world he modeled, and you follow him. It's not a denigration of his Christology. It's not seeing him as lesser than God or anything, quite the opposite, but it's recognizing that a main reason for writing a biography is so that you can follow the main character. So to sum up, I would define the Gospels genre in this way, that they are the theological, historical, and aretological, which is a made-up word meaning virtue-forming. So theological, historical, and aretological biographical narratives that retell the story and proclaim the significance of Jesus Christ, who through the power of the Spirit is the restorer of God's reign. They are given to us as a great gift that are meant to be read in a way that we can not only learn the teaching and learn Jesus' nature, but also be his followers in joy. One of the other really important things beyond just recognizing the genre of learning to read the Gospels and Acts wisely and well is recognizing that they are pieces of narrative literature. What I want to talk about is the importance of literary context, in fact, a number of literary contexts to reading a gospel pericope well. And again, just to be very clear, a pericope is the term going back to a very long time ago to refer to a small gospel unit, an episode, a section of a story. And that's what are usually broken up, of course, in our Bibles by different headings that are put there. So what I want to talk about is the importance of narrative context. Now, I like to begin this discussion by actually sharing a brief story from my own family life about the great musical Fiddler on the Roof. And the story I like to tell about it is that I had listened to that soundtrack from childhood and had seen the movie, but it had been many years, and several years ago I brought the soundtrack home and started to listen to it with my kids, and they started playing it on the piano and violin, and we'd sing the songs, and it's just great music. And after a while, as we listened to the stories, we're all singing them, and sometimes, you can be singing a song, you don't even know what it's about, and then you begin to realize, what is that song talking about? And so the kids would begin to ask me questions, what does he mean by that, or what does she mean by that in this song? And I hadn't seen the movie itself in quite a while, so I was able to answer some of those questions. But on the other hand, I didn't know sometimes what exactly was going on in a story, and sometimes it turns out I was mistaken. What happened is then one year for Father's Day, then a few months after listening to the soundtrack, they got me the actual full 3-hour movie. And we sat down to watch it, all excited about it. And when we watched the actual full musical, and of course, all throughout it, the same songs that we'd come to know from the soundtrack came up, several remarkable things happened. In some cases, that my interpretation or our interpretation of the song from just listening to the soundtrack was absolutely right. It made sense in the storyline. At other times, it turned out that I had completely misunderstood, or the kids and I had misunderstood what one of the songs was saying once you saw in its narrative context. But in every instance, every one of those songs had so much more depth and meaning once we heard them or experienced them in the flow of the whole story that was being presented as Fiddler on the Roof. And that, I think, is a great analogy of what happens when we read gospel pericopes, or really any part of the Bible, is that we tend to treat the Bible as if it were a soundtrack, and we miss the bigger story. Now, when we talk about the bigger story, we can talk about the whole biblical, theological, salvation, historical story of the Bible. It's all true. What I want to talk about is particularly starting at a more narrow place and working our way out and thinking about each gospel pericope having a greater meaning by paying attention to the series of concentric circles in which it's found. So if you envision like a target with different concentric circles, if you think of the center of that as an individual gospel pericope that we could use other skills and techniques on to do a sort of narrative analysis of this, moving beyond that narrative analysis, that individual pericope, let's think together for a few minutes about the various contexts in which each of these are found. Now, as a side note related to that, what I'm not talking about here is historical context. Let me be very, very clear. Historical context is really helpful. It's very helpful to think about the fact that every gospel story, every story actually happened in a time of Jesus' day, and then also every gospel story came from and reflects a time of the writer who's putting it together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the one who's composing and crafting this form of retelling this story. So historical context matters both to sometimes help us understand what's going on, like who the Pharisees are, or why would they care about things being clean or unclean. That kind of historical information is helpful, and at the same time recognizing that each of the evangelists are writing out of their own time frame as well. Now, so I just want to affirm that the Gospels have historical referentiality. They have a connection to real history, both in what they're talking about and where they're coming from themselves in their production. The problem is, though, is that kind of historical reconstruction emphasis can actually very quickly become overdone. And we can end up squashing the text itself by our historical reconstruction of it. And so I want to encourage us to value historical information, historical background information. It's very helpful, but to keep it in its place. As with many things we can say about historical information, it's a good servant, but a bad master. And for many people, including many people who believe the Bible and read it faithfully, as well as those who don't, often historical reconstruction is the master. It is the controlling idea for how to read a gospel pericope. And I just want to say, hold the phone on that. That is not the primary and the first thing to emphasize when we talk about reading a gospel story wisely or reading it well. So, but still to value that. So you got to keep that in balance, moderation in all things. And part of the reason why, one final side note on the side note, is part of the reason why this historical reconstruction can be dangerous in actual working its way out is that one of the things that's happened in scholarship is that many scholars have taken the Gospels and have recreated a community and a whole theology coming from a community that's behind the text of the Gospel. So a Johannine community and a Matthean community, for example, that has its own theology. There's a Q community and a Q theology. We don't even have Q. It's this, reconstruction of what's shared in Mark and Luke. And from those, people have created whole theologies of how there were different versions of Christianity. There was Johannine Christianity and Matthean and Q, and that they were in conflict with each other. And so a lot of scholarship in the 19th and 20th centuries especially really emphasized using the Gospels to get behind what was really going on. And I think that's kind of the worst, most perverse sort of sense of the mastery of historical reconstruction squashing what the text is actually saying. So that's just an example of the danger of that approach, even though there's still some value in it. What I want to concentrate on then is, again, the more literary and canonical context of an actual gospel pericope. So back to our concentric circles idea. First thing I want to say is that each gospel pericope occurs in a series of acts and cycles and literary structures. So the first kind of few levels of concentric circles moving out is to recognize that each gospel pericope is put there by the evangelist with an intentionality. Okay? If you think again about, they are not just giving pearls on a string that are randomly thrown together. They are actually intentionally selecting and deselecting and fitting together gospel stories. And the first thing we'd say that they're fitted together usually into an act or a series of acts. And we just define an act as several sequentially related stories. So just simply an act. And if you have a Bible and want to look there, you can look at some examples. A very nice, clear example of this is Luke chapter 15. In Luke chapter 15, you have a series of stories that are well known to us. The most famous one is the one we call the prodigal son, better titled actually the parable of the two sons, would be a better title. But if you look at that parable in Luke 15, 11 through 32, I believe it is, we recognize that although that has an integrity to itself and is worth doing a narrative analysis on and paying attention to theologically and historically and everything else, it turns out that Luke has clearly intended us for us to see that as part of a series of at least 3 parables that are also in Luke 15. So if you let your eyes glance back to the parables before it, starting in Luke 15:3, verses 3 through 7, then again in verses 8 through 10, you have a series of parables that are clearly related to each other. They're all parables of lostness. In fact, parables that have a development across them of increasing value of what was lost. 1 out of 100 sheep, 1 out of 10 coins, and then 1 out of 2 sons. And part of the way we can see that this is an act, that is, it's not just an individual pericope, is because he repeats the same phrases throughout them. And this is a softball. This is slow pitch for Luke here. He's given us that we can easily hit this out of the park. He says at the end of each of them, I tell you there be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. So he gives us literary and auditory clues, people would be hearing that, to help us see that these parables are all connected. And once you see that, you see, wow, this is important because this is an act of parables together that therefore, and here's the point, the meaning of any individual pericope is actually affected, and we might even say constrained by paying attention to the ones that it's put together with in an act. And then even beyond that, you see there's a heading to these 3 parables in 15:1. If you have a Bible, let your eyes rest there for a moment. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him, and the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So, verse 3, he told them this parable. So those first 2 verses are really important in their effect of how to read the parable. So if we just read or preached on 15:8 through 10, it's not the end of the world. God uses even bad sermons, right, and bad interpretations, and even that wouldn't be a bad interpretation. There's value in just preaching or teaching 15:8 to 10. But the best and wisest reading is going to recognize that it's part of 3 parables that are connected, and they all have a heading at the beginning that sets up why Jesus is telling these parables. And then, of course, you really want to pay attention to the climactic one, which very interestingly ends open-endedly. That's what's really striking about this 3rd parable. Ups the ante beyond all the others. It has a colophon, a tailpiece, where it's not just that the lost thing comes back and they rejoice, the sheep or the coin or the son. There's another person in there who's mad about the rejoicing going on, right? So that element's there, and that extra tailpiece is significant. That really highlights that it's the thing that is different from the other 2 parables in the escalating series of 3 that really stands apart, and that's exactly what connects back to 15:1 and 2, and you can see it all serves together as an act. It's really one text together that we're meant to see that this parable of the 2 sons is first and foremost about the people who are grumbling at God giving grace to people, right? So again, it is about God rejoicing and us rejoicing over people coming back, absolutely true, but recognizing the greater series that are going on there significantly helps our interpretation, the best kind of reading. So that's a good example. And then, so we can also recognize that not only are individual stories in a series of stories together, and that's just one example of many, but those series of stories, those acts, are often put together into cycles. One of the most common recognizable cycles that's throughout the Gospels would just be the fact that in the synoptic tradition, all 3 of them follow, I think following Mark's lead here, a big series of cycles of time in Galilee, journey to Jerusalem, and then time in Jerusalem. Mark, Matthew, and Luke all follow that exact same pattern. They each do something a little different within it. Luke, here we were just in Luke 15, so we can point him out. He really expands the journey to Jerusalem section. He includes most of his unique material, his material that's his own, in that journey to Jerusalem section. But the point is recognizing that when we're in recognizing that there are larger units, or what we might call cycles, within the Gospels that are series of acts put together. So again, the point is, when you're looking at any individual pericope, it's helpful to pay attention to where it's in its act and where it's in its cycle. And then the third one of these I mentioned is just more broadly the literary structure. Now, in some sense, we could say that Acts and Cycles kind of cover it, but I also just like to use this kind of generic category of a literary structure, recognizing that often a series of pericopes or pericopi are put together. And let me give you another example of this. I showed you one in Luke 15, but if you look at Matthew chapter 21, you'll see a whole series of parables that very interestingly, I keep saying parables, a series of pericopes that go together. And so this will kind of model what I'm talking about here. Matthew 21, beginning in verse 28. So you have what the title that is probably in your Bible says something like the parable of the two sons. And again, there's an integrity to that story. You could analyze it by itself. But if you let your concentric circle goggles get a little bigger, you can start to say, what else is going on in the stories around? And that's the big thing I'm wanting to get. Pay attention to this. You'll see that there's another parable right after it in chapter 21 of Matthew, verses 33 and following, that is also has something to do with, as you may notice, a son, right? Particularly the climactic sending of the son. And then the third teaching in a row is in chapter 22, verses 1 to 14, which even more climactically deals with a son and the sending of a son. And so what you have, if you're pulling up, you can recognize that you have three sonship parables, that is, three parables about people doing one thing or another based on the theme of a son. And then, so you might say, okay, well, that's helpful. That's kind of like Luke 15. That's helpful. But if you pull up another level, you can see then that what happens after that is there are three challenging questions that different people come to try to trap Jesus. So in Matthew 22, 15 to 22, and then in Matthew 22, 23 to 33, and then finally in 22, 34 to 40, you have three times where the Jerusalem-based leaders try to trap Jesus to get him in trouble, arrested, and killed. Okay, so you may say, well, that's not related at all. But if you pull back up, then you'll see one more story after that. In 22, 41 following, you see that Jesus then turns on them and asks the ultimate stumping question. And what does it deal with? It's whose son? It's a sonship stumping question. Okay, so just think with me for a minute. You have three parables about sonship that are critical of the Pharisees and Sadducees for being faithless religious leaders. Then you have three challenging questions from those same people. And then the seventh story in this series is where Jesus asks them a stumping question, which is all about sonship. It's about whose son is David, and of course the answer is himself. Now you may say, what is that, hocus pocus stuff? I want to say to you, this is how the evangelists write and thought, because it's very powerful communication, and it also is very memorable, because again, most people are going to experience this book never having read it. Most people did not read in the ancient world and throughout much of history of the world. Instead, people are going to experience these stories orally and auditorily, and they're going to memorize them by hearing them. And this series of 3 and 3 and 1, which is very, very important, this series of 7 is very significant, and they're all connected. And if you pull back even another level, you'll see that what I'm saying isn't, I'm not making this up, because this whole greater cycle or literary structure, which this is a part, starts way back in chapter 21, which is the final stage, the entry into Jerusalem, where it is emphasized at the end of chapter 20 that Jesus is the son of David, with the two men of Jericho crying out. And then the whole triumphal entry in chapter 21 emphasizes that he is the son of David, and they cry out to him. Look at what they cry out. Hosanna to son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's what opens chapter 21 as Jesus enters Jerusalem. The strong emphasis that he is the son of David. Then they challenge his authority. He tells them 3 sonship parables. They ask 3 challenging questions. Then he asks them a sonship challenging question that stumps them. And this whole thing ends in chapter 23. If you let your fingers do the walking and get over to chapter 23, you'll see that Matthew has tied this all together after the woes on the Pharisees, his lament on Jerusalem. And he says at the end of chapter 23, I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, verse 39, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The exact same phrase that was there at the beginning of chapter 21. Matthew wants us to see that this is a literary structure. This is a literary unit. We could even call it a cycle if you wanted. But this chapter 21 to 23 is one big unit that something else that happened in chapter 20. Chapter 24 is the beginning of the fifth major discourse in Matthew. We don't have time to get into all that, but it's the eschatological discourse which happens in Jerusalem. Matthew wants us to pay attention to this series of stories and how they go together, and he gives us these literary clues to pay attention to that. Why does it matter? It's because when you get back up at that higher level of altitude, you see that the stories are not just about what's happening in them individually, they are about how they relate to the other stories. And the best and wisest reading is going to pay attention to those kind of acts and cycles and larger literary structures, okay? So those literary devices are there. They are intended. They're part of writing a good biography. They're structures put into the text by skillful writers, the evangelists, and for us to be skillful readers means that we pay attention to those patterns, recognizing that a story's meaning is beyond its own micro context, it's part of this larger literary context. Okay, so to bring this home then, to just say one more thing let me move beyond. That's, I think, the most important thing. And again, you don't have to have a PhD or even a Master of Divinity to be able to do that. You just have to be a thoughtful reader. Just say, what is this saying here? And does this relate to any other stories around it? Let's pull up. Think of yourself in a helicopter or climbing up a ladder, and you keep looking down at larger and larger maps in the Bible, not actual maps, but how the stories are fitted together. And just ask yourself, just be an active reader. How does this relate to that? How does this relate to that? And start asking yourself, and I just want to encourage you, there's a lot there. The evangelists are very skilled, and they intend you to see these things after many readings, okay? Moving beyond that kind of reading of literary structures and cycles, we can just show you a couple of more concentric circles very briefly. One is to always remember that when you're interpreting an individual story, you also pay attention to the whole gospel story. For example, there are themes and ideas that go from the beginning to the end of a gospel that are very important for you to recognize. An obvious one, I think, is the theme of God with us. For example, let's use Matthew. That's what Jesus is given as a name in chapter 1, verse 23, right? So that's pretty important right there in the prologue. His name will be Emmanuel, God with us. Then where else does God with us appear? Well, I hope you can think of chapter 18, verse 20, where in the ecclesiological discourse, where Jesus has now redefined the people of God based not on ethnicity, but based on faith response in Him, Jew and Gentile. He's reconstituted the ecclesia of the Old Testament Septuagint word for the assembly. He's reconstituted that in Himself as being Jew and Gentile, all who respond to Him in faith. And He says in this great promise that we usually use at the prayer meeting for hoping, our numbers aren't very good at the Wednesday night prayer meeting, but it's okay because we've got Matthew 18:20. There I am in your midst. What He's saying is, you ragamuffin, ragtag band of followers, imperfect people, non-trained, non-rabbis, non-Jerusalem-based, non-temple controlling people are now the ecclesia of God. You're the people of God. And what you decide doctrinally and church disciplinally, I am with you in that. Now that I am with you, so that itself is a very significant claim, but that I am with you is tied back to 123 and in terms of Jesus as God's presence, and then of course it's how the Gospel of Matthew ends as well. The very famous Great Commission, where He then commissions His new ecclesia to go to ta ethne, all the nations, and make disciples, teaching all that we've just learned about, and by reading through Matthew, teach all that to His two new disciples, and His promise ends with saying, I am with you till the end of the age. That theme of God being with us in Jesus and God's presence with us is something that you're only going to pay attention to, you're only going to get if you pay attention to the whole gospel story. You're not going to get that in any individual story, and so any individual pericope. So it's really important to pay attention to those sort of things, and that's just one example of many. Another then is related to the whole gospel story is the idea that you need to recognize that every one of the gospels in all their diversity emphasize very much Jesus' death and resurrection. All the gospels slow way down at the end of their telling of the story to focus. Sometimes half of the chapters of the book for most of the evangelists are given to just Jesus' death and resurrection. That's very significant, and the implications for us to be good readers, as you think about that sort of concentric circle of the whole gospel story, is to recognize that any individual story must be understood in light of that final goal of Jesus dying on behalf of the sins of His people and rising from the dead and conquering death and sin and tearing the temple veil and opening access to God, all that. Because a classic example of this would be one of the most important parts of the whole Bible, Matthew 5 to 7, the Sermon on the Mount, the most read and interpreted and preached and commented upon part of the whole Bible throughout church history. That Sermon on the Mount is essential. It's very important to understand who Jesus is and what God cares about. Yet, it's so easy to read that, to rip it out of its context and knock all the soil of it, all the Matthean soil off, and plant it and make it a new Christianity, which is something that Matthew would never desire, nor Jesus, because that Sermon on the Mount is part of the story in which the king and the teacher of the sermon dies and rises on behalf of those to whom he's teaching this, and enables us by the giving of the Spirit. You think this is where the book of Acts comes in so importantly as well, the giving of the Spirit to enable us to, still imperfectly, but live out the Sermon on the Mount. If you take that Sermon on the Mount as just one example and rip it out of the context of that whole gospel story, you will lose its ultimate meaning. Okay, so the point again, it's just another example of any individual pericope, even in that case, an act or a cycle of the Sermon on the Mount has got to be read in its whole gospel story. And then also, moving another level out, what we call the fourfold gospel book context. Each gospel has an integrity to it, but God has given us 4 gospels that are complementary and dovetail with each other. And that fourfold gospel book became very early on circulated as one book, and the books circulated separately too, but they came to be circulated together and given a name, the Tetraeuangelion, the fourfold gospel book. In fact, for a long time, they never were called the Gospels. They were called, the 4 together were called the Gospel, kata, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. The Gospel. So there's an inherent built-in recognition of their great unity and intra-complementarity, and that's very important also when we're reading an individual pericope. All right? Now, let me say something a little nuanced here that's important. What this means is, when you're reading an individual story, you can both read it, what we'd say, horizontally and vertically. You can read it horizontally, which means you look at the story, let's say, take the Sermon on the Mount again, and you go to Luke chapter 6 or Luke chapter 11, the places where parts of the Sermon on the Mount reappear in Luke, and you can compare them. That's what we call a horizontal reading, all right? I want to say that there is, because these 4 books are all canonical and together they form the gospel according to, there is value in doing that. Just as there is value in reading Matthew 27 alongside with 1 Corinthians 15 and any other text we can think of in the book of Proverbs, whatever it is, we can rightly read all texts in comparison and analogy with each other. That's the nature of Holy Scripture, having a canon, not just individual writings. Period. So that's valuable. However, that horizontal reading isn't the most important kind of reading, I would suggest to you, relative to what we'd call the vertical reading, where you pay attention to how Matthew has developed his stories. If you imagine Matthew in one column and Luke in another and Mark and John, this kind of horizontal reading where you compare pericopes, that's valuable. But that, I think, tends to be overdone by us, because what we end up doing is we don't really pay attention to what Matthew is doing in these kind of literary structures that we're talking about, or what Luke is doing in these literary structures, right? So I want to say something here in tension. I want to acknowledge that because they're canonical, there's value in this concentric circle of reading across, and I also want to raise a little red flag of just be careful that stands in tension with recognizing that each evangelist has developed a literary structure, and that's probably the thing to preference above all. Hope that makes sense, okay? And the final thing I'll say then about these concentric circles is, of course, the whole canonical story. And this is the biggest literary context. Just take the theme of God with us again. You recognize that in Matthew, it's at some key places in Matthew, but of course, that's not unique to Matthew. That's a huge theme of Genesis through Revelation. In fact, you think about how the book of Revelation ends, there is no longer a need for the Son because God Himself is there present with His people. That's the great hope. And you think of Genesis, before the fall, that is exactly what Adam and Eve's experience was. They were together with God in His presence. So thinking about any individual story, so if you're preaching or teaching Matthew 1:23, for example, it's entirely appropriate and wise for you to recognize this whole series of not only Matthean connections with God's presence, but the whole Bible. So the point here for us is simply that we recognize that while historical context matters, the most important thing we can do to be good, wise, and well-trained readers is to simply, again, pay attention to this series of concentric literary circles. Acts, cycles, literary structures, whole gospel context, fourfold gospel context, connections with Paul, who's also complementary, and connections with the whole Bible as well. And I think that will help us be good and wise readers of the Gospels and Acts.